The DNA test that exposed 150 years of inbreeding started as a simple search for ancestry. Two Melungeon sisters from Appalachia just wanted to learn about their heritage in 1989. Instead, they uncovered a hidden family nightmare that stretched back to 1840. The results were horrifying. Generation after generation of cousins marrying cousins, brothers marrying sisters, all hidden in a mountain community that would kill to keep their secrets buried. When the sisters started digging deeper, they found unmarked graves of sickly children scattered across their family land, car tires slashed, dead birds left on their porch, warnings to stop looking. But the most chilling discovery was a diary from the 1880s, written by their own ancestor, a woman forced to marry her brother to keep the family land. Her words revealed the true horror of what survival meant in those isolated hollows. The sheriff tried to stop them. Their own aunt begged them to stay silent. An entire town conspired to hide the truth. But why would a whole community protect such a dark secret, and how many families were really involved? The October mist clung to the Appalachian ridges like secrets whispered in the dark, and Alara Goins stood at her kitchen window, watching it roll through the hollows below, thinking about blood and belonging. The coffee in her hands had grown cold while she stared at the university letter that had arrived 3 days ago, its official letterhead promising answers she had been seeking her entire 28 years. Behind her, Maeve moved through the small kitchen with the quiet grace that had always marked her younger sister, setting out plates for breakfast as if this were any ordinary morning, as if the weight of their family's unspoken sorrows wasn't pressing down on them like the low-hanging clouds outside. "You're still thinking about that letter," Maeve said without turning around, her voice carrying that gentle knowing that came from sharing a life, sharing a house, sharing the peculiar burden of being Goins women in a place where your name followed you like a shadow. Alara turned from the window, studying her sister's profile in the early morning light. At 25, Maeve possessed the kind of beauty that made people forget to breathe. Dark hair that caught light like water, eyes the color of mountain laurel, skin that seemed to hold its own luminescence. But it was a beauty shadowed by something indefinable, a melancholy that seemed woven into the very fabric of their being, passed down through generations of women who had learned to carry their pain quietly. "The Melungeon Heritage Project," Alara said, holding up the letter. "They want volunteers for genetic testing, families with documented Melungeon ancestry." She paused, watching her sister's shoulders tense slightly. "They say it could help us understand our origins, trace our lineage back through the centuries." Maeve finally turned, and Alara saw the familiar flicker of apprehension cross her features. "What do we need to understand that we don't already know? We're mountain people. We've always been mountain people." But that wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. The Goins family, like so many others scattered through these eastern Kentucky hills, carried stories that were half-whispered, half-remembered, full of gaps and contradictions. They were descended from the Melungeons, that mysterious mixed-race population that had inhabited these mountains for centuries. People who claimed to be Portuguese or Cherokee or anything other than what the outside world insisted they were. People who had been pushed to the margins, relegated to the poorest land, subjected to the kind of casual cruelties that came with being different in a place that demanded conformity. Alara had grown up hearing the whispers in town, the way conversation stopped when she and Maeve entered the general store, the subtle but unmistakable signs that their family occupied a particular place in the rigid social hierarchy of their small community. The Goins were Melungeon, and that meant something here, something that tasted like shame and felt like exile, even when you had never left home. "I want to know where we come from," Alara said, moving to sit across from her sister at the small wooden table their grandfather had built with his own hands. "Really no, not just the stories and the rumors and the things people say behind our backs. I want scientific proof of who we are." Maeve poured coffee into both their cups, her movements deliberate and careful. "Some things are better left alone, Ellie." It was an old argument between them, this tension between Ilara's relentless curiosity and Maeve's preference for letting sleeping dogs lie. Ilara had always been the one to ask uncomfortable questions, to press against the boundaries their community had drawn around acceptable inquiry. She taught history at the local high school, and perhaps that professional obligation to seek truth had infected her personal life as well. She couldn't accept the vague explanations, the family stories that seemed to shift and change depending on who was telling them and how much they had been drinking when they did. "What if the things people say about us aren't true?" Ilara pressed. "What if we're not what they think we are? What if our ancestors were something more, something better than the stories they tell?" Maeve wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if trying to warm something deeper than her fingers. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the familiar landscape of their childhood, the steep hillsides covered in oak and maple, the narrow creek that wound through their property, the old family cemetery where their parents lay buried beneath weathered stones that bore names but precious few dates. "And what if they're exactly what they think we are?" Maeve asked quietly. "What if the truth is worse than the rumors?" The question hung between them like smoke, acrid and uncomfortable. Ilara had considered this possibility, of course. She wasn't naive. She knew that sometimes the truth revealed things you wished you had never learned. But the not knowing had been eating at her for years, this sense that their family carried some secret burden that none of them quite understood, but all of them felt. She had seen it in her mother's face during those last months before the cancer took her, the way the woman would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare off into the distance as if seeing ghosts. She had heard it in her father's voice when he drank too much and talked about the old days, about families that had disappeared from the hollows, about children who were born different, and the whispered explanations that followed. There was something their parents had known but never shared, something that had shaped their lives in ways Ilara was only beginning to understand. "The testing is free," she said finally. "All we have to do is provide saliva samples. They'll do the rest." Maeve was quiet for a long moment, and Ilara could see her sister wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, Maeve sighed and looked up, meeting Ilara's eyes across the table. "If I agree to this," she said, "if I let them test our blood and dig into our past, you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that whatever we learn, whatever the truth turns out to be, we'll face it together, no matter how bad it gets." Ilara reached across the table and took her sister's hand, feeling the calluses from Maeve's work at the library, the familiar warmth of the only person in the world who truly understood what it meant to be a Goins woman in these unforgiving mountains. "I promise," she said, and meant it, even though she couldn't possibly imagine what that promise would eventually cost them both. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 weeks after they had sent their saliva samples to the university laboratory, and Ilara knew immediately that something was wrong by the weight of it in her hands. She had expected a single page, maybe two, with charts and percentages that would finally put names to the genetic puzzle of their heritage. Instead, the packet felt substantial, official, like the kind of documentation that preceded lawsuits or life insurance payouts or other calamities that required extensive paperwork. Maeve found her sister standing in their small living room, the envelope torn open and its contents scattered across the coffee table their father had carved from a single piece of cherry wood. The initial report looked exactly like what Ilara had imagined. Neat columns of numbers and ethnic percentages that confirmed what they had always known. 62% European, primarily British Isles, with traces of Iberian Peninsula. 28% Sub-Saharan African, concentrated in West and Central African populations, 8% Native American, most likely Cherokee, 2% unassigned, which the report explained was common in mixed populations that had been isolated for extended periods. "So we're Melungeon," Maeve said, settling beside her sister on the couch, "just like we always knew." But Ilara was staring at a second document, one that bore the university's letterhead and the signature of Dr. Marcus Hendricks, the project's lead geneticist. The language was dense, clinical, full of terms that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Phrases like consanguineous relationships and elevated homozygosity patterns and significant endogamous population structure filled the page like warnings written in a foreign tongue. The phone rang while they were still puzzling through the technical jargon, and Ilara answered it with a strange sense of inevitability, as if she had been expecting this call her entire life without knowing it. "Miss Goins, this is Dr. Hendricks from the Melungeon Heritage Project." His voice carried an uncomfortable formality, the tone of a man who had rehearsed difficult conversations. "I wanted to discuss your test results personally." "We received the report," Ilara said, gesturing for Maeve to sit closer so she could hear. "The percentages look about right for what we expected." There was a pause, long enough that Ilara wondered if the connection had been lost. When Dr. Hendricks spoke again, his voice had dropped to something approaching a whisper. "Miss Goins, I need to explain something to you that isn't clear in the written report. Your DNA shows patterns that are unusual, concerning from a genetic standpoint." Another pause. "What I'm seeing suggests a very high degree of endogamy in your family line. That means marriages between close relatives, possibly spanning multiple generations." The words hit Ilara like cold water, and she felt Maeve's hand tighten around her arm. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that your genetic markers indicate a family history of marriages between first cousins, possibly closer relationships than that. The pattern is so pronounced that it suggests this wasn't an isolated occurrence, but rather a systematic practice over an extended period of time." Ilara found herself struggling to form words, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to consider. There must be some mistake. Mountain families intermarried sometimes, sure, but what you're describing? "I've run the analysis 3 times, Dr. Hendricks said gently. "I even brought in a colleague to verify the results. Miss Goins, I've been studying Appalachian genetics for 15 years, and I've never seen patterns quite like this. The degree of endogamy in your family line is extreme, even by the standards of isolated mountain populations." After the call ended, the sisters sat in silence, staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something more palatable. Finally, Maeve spoke, her voice barely audible. "It can't be true." But even as she said it, Ilara felt something shifting inside her chest, a recognition that felt like remembering a dream upon waking. The persistent melancholy that seemed to haunt their family, the way their parents had always deflected questions about their ancestry, the strange gaps in their family stories that had never quite made sense, suddenly these things took on a different weight, a more sinister significance. "We need to talk to Aunt Ophelia," Ilara said. Their great-aunt lived alone in a weathered farmhouse at the end of a dirt road that wound deep into the mountains, a place that felt cut off from the modern world by more than simple geography. Ophelia Goins was 73 years old and had never married, never left these hills, never shown any interest in anything beyond the small circle of her daily routines. She was the keeper of the family's oral history, the one who remembered names and dates and stories that went back generations. They found her on her front porch, rocking slowly in a chair that was probably older than she was, her eyes fixed on some distant point among the mountains. When they showed her the genetic report and tried to explain what the doctor had told them, her reaction was immediate and violent. "You foolish girls," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "What did you think you were doing letting strangers poke around in our business?" "We just wanted to understand our heritage," Maeve said. "We thought—" "You thought wrong." Ophelia stood abruptly, the rocking chair creaking to a stop behind her. "Some things are better left buried. Some truths are too heavy for the living to carry." Ilara felt her teacher's instincts kick in, the part of her that had spent years encouraging students to ask hard questions and dig deeper into uncomfortable historical realities. "Aunt Ophelia, if there's something we need to know about our family, something that might explain—" "Explain what?" The old woman's eyes blazed with something that might have been fear or fury or both. "Explain why we've always been different. Explain why people in town look at us sideways. Explain why our children are born with shadows in their eyes." She turned toward the front door, then stopped and looked back at them over her shoulder. "Let sleeping dogs lie, girls. Trust me on this. Some secrets are kept for good reason." That night, Ilara couldn't sleep. She found herself in the attic of their childhood home, surrounded by the detritus of generations, old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of photographs and documents, the accumulated weight of a family's history. She was looking for something, though she couldn't have said what, guided by an instinct that felt like hunger. She found the chest pushed far back under the eaves, a heavy wooden box secured with an old padlock that had rusted nearly through. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at her touch, were 3 family Bibles, dating back to the 1840s. The family trees inscribed in the front pages told a story that made her hands shake as she traced the names with her finger. Names that repeated in patterns that shouldn't exist, marriage dates that connected people who shared grandparents, children whose parentage seemed deliberately obscured, their fathers listed simply as unknown or not listed at all. Beneath the Bibles, she found the photographs, dozens of them, sepia-toned faces, staring out from another century. And as she studied them in the dim attic light, she began to see what Aunt Ophelia had meant about shadows in their eyes. It was there in every face, that same haunted expression she recognized from her own mirror, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have been carved into their very bones. When Maeve found her hours later, Ilara was still sitting on the attic floor, surrounded by the evidence of their family's dark secret, finally understanding that the truth they had been seeking was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The courthouse in Pineville sat like a monument to bureaucratic indifference, its red brick facade weathered by decades of mountain winters and the kind of willful blindness that small towns cultivate when uncomfortable truths threaten to surface. Ilara and Maeve climbed the worn stone steps on a gray December morning, armed with the names they had copied from the family Bibles and a growing sense that they were walking into hostile territory. The clerk at the records office, a thin woman with steel-gray hair and suspicious eyes, looked at their request with the kind of disdain usually reserved for people who tracked mud across clean floors. "Marriage records from the 1840s, she said, her voice sharp with skepticism. "What do you need those old things for?" Ilara had prepared for this question, had rehearsed a response that would sound academic and harmless. "Family genealogy research. We're trying to trace our lineage back through the Melungeon settlements." The word Melungeon seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and Ilara watched the clerk's expression shift from mild irritation to something approaching alarm. "I'll need to check with Sheriff Mullins about accessing those particular records. Some of the older documents are restricted." They waited on a hard wooden bench in the hallway for nearly an hour before Sheriff Brody Mullins appeared, his substantial frame filling the doorway to his office, as he studied them with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. He was a man in his late 50s who wore his authority like armor, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations who had kept certain secrets buried. "Heard you girls are poking around an old family business," he said without preamble. Might want to ask yourselves why those records aren't readily available. Sometimes things get lost for good reason. Maeve shifted uncomfortably beside her sister, but Alara felt her spine straighten, with the kind of defiance that had gotten her into trouble since childhood. "We have a right to access public records, Sheriff." "Public records, sure," Mullen said, his smile lacking any warmth. "But some of those old documents from back then, well, they've been damaged by water, mice, general deterioration. Amazing how fragile paper can be when it's been sitting in damp basements for over 100 years. The message was clear, and they left the courthouse empty-handed, but Alara's determination had only hardened. If the local authorities wanted to play games, she would find another way. The next morning, she drove the 2 hours to the State Archives in Frankfurt, leaving Maeve to pursue her own lines of inquiry at the library where she worked. The State Archives were a revelation, a vast repository of documents that no small-town sheriff could control or manipulate. Dr. Sarah Whitman, the archivist who assisted her, was a professional historian who understood the importance of preserving even uncomfortable truths. Together, they pulled census records, marriage licenses, death certificates, and property deeds that painted a picture so disturbing that Alara found herself having to step outside for fresh air multiple times during her research. The pattern was undeniable once you knew how to look for it. The Goins family, along with several other Melungeon clans, had been systematically intermarrying for generations. Brothers married sisters, first cousins wed each other with alarming frequency, and in some cases the relationships appeared even closer than that. But it wasn't random or accidental, it was deliberate, carefully orchestrated to keep property within the family, to maintain what little wealth and land they possessed in a hostile environment that had pushed them to the margins of society. The census records from 1850 showed her ancestors living on the most marginal land, the steep hillsides and rocky hollows that no one else wanted. By 1870, some families had simply disappeared from the records altogether, their names crossed out or replaced with question marks. Property deeds told a story of gradual dispossession, of Melungeon families being forced to sell their better lands to white settlers and retreat ever deeper into the mountains. Meanwhile, Maeve was conducting her own investigation in the basement archives of the county library, using her insider access to explore collections that the general public rarely saw. She found newspaper clippings from the early 1900s that referred obliquely to the peculiar customs of certain mountain families and children born with the mark of their heritage. Most disturbing were the brief mentions of infant mortality rates in certain hollows, statistics that suggested something was seriously wrong but never stated it directly. Her breakthrough came through Mrs. Eleanor Craft, an 87-year-old volunteer who had been helping to digitize the library's local history collection. Mrs. Craft remembered her own grandmother talking about the Hollow people and their strange ways, stories passed down through generations of women who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to forget entirely. "My grandmother used to say they kept to themselves up in those hills," Mrs. Craft whispered, glancing around the empty library as if afraid of being overheard. "Said they had their own ways of doing things, their own rules about who could marry who. She used to tell me that their children were born different, that you could see it in their eyes, like they carried some kind of sadness that went back generations." When the sisters compared their findings that evening, the full scope of their family's history began to emerge. It wasn't just inbreeding, it was systematic isolation, generations of people trapped by poverty, prejudice, and their own desperate attempts to survive in a world that had marked them as other. The closer familial relationships weren't born of depravity, but of necessity. Communities so small and so isolated that outsiders were either unwelcome or unwilling to settle among them. But understanding the historical context didn't make the reality any less horrifying. The genetic damage was real, documented in cryptic references to sickly children and early deaths, and the kind of birth defects that rural communities attributed to God's will rather than acknowledge their human causes. The sadness that Ilara and Maeve had always felt, that persistent melancholy that seemed woven into their very DNA, wasn't just inherited trauma, it was the genetic echo of generations of compromised biology. The community's response to their investigation escalated from passive resistance to active hostility. Ilara came out of the grocery store one afternoon to find her car tires slashed, the cuts deliberate and clean, sending a message that was impossible to misinterpret. 2 days later, Maeve found a dead crow nailed to their front door, its wings spread in a grotesque parody of crucifixion with a note that said simply, "Stop." But they couldn't stop. Not now. The truth was like a living thing that had been buried alive, clawing its way to the surface, despite every attempt to keep it contained. Every document they uncovered, every whispered story they collected, every piece of evidence they assembled, brought them closer to understanding not just their family's history, but the systematic conspiracy of silence that had protected it for over a century. They were no longer just researching their ancestry. They were excavating a mass grave of buried secrets, and something in the mountains was watching them dig. The graves were hidden beneath decades of undergrowth in the far corner of the family property, where the land sloped down toward the creek, and ancient oak trees created perpetual twilight, even in the middle of the day. Ilara might have walked past them 100 times in her childhood without noticing, but now, armed with the terrible knowledge they had accumulated, she could see the subtle depressions in the earth, the stones that had once marked final resting places before weather and time had claimed them. Maeve stood beside her sister in the dappled shadows, counting the small mounds with growing horror. 7, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of water moving over stones. 7 little graves. They had come here following a reference in one of the old documents, a property deed from 1863 that mentioned the children's plot behind the old cabin site. Ilara had assumed it referred to a formal family cemetery, perhaps the resting place of ancestors who had died in childhood from the usual diseases that claimed mountain children in those days. She had not expected to find this, unmarked graves scattered without pattern or care, as if the children buried here had been hidden even in death. The implications were immediate and devastating. These were the sickly children referenced in the whispered stories, the infants born with the kind of genetic damage that rural communities in the 1800s had no way to understand or treat. Children whose very existence was evidence of the unthinkable choices their ancestors had been forced to make, whose brief lives had been sacrificed on the altar of survival and secrecy. Maeve sank to her knees beside the smallest grave, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. "We have to stop," she said without looking up. "Ellie, we have to stop this right now." But Ilara couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, even as she watched her sister's composure crumble like paper in rain. The weight of what they had discovered was crushing, but it was also clarifying. These unnamed children deserved to have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged. The women who had borne them and buried them in secret deserved to have their anguish recognized rather than hidden away like something shameful. "These are our family," Ilara said, her voice thick with emotion she was struggling to control. "These babies are our blood, and they've been lying here in unmarked graves for over a century, while everyone pretended they never existed. And maybe that's better." Maeve turned on her sister with sudden fury, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Maybe some things are supposed to stay buried. Maybe our ancestors knew something we don't about the cost of truth." The argument that followed was unlike anything that had ever passed between them, words cutting like broken glass, accusations and counter-accusations that revealed the fault lines in their relationship that had been widening since this investigation began. Maeve accused Ilara of selfishness, of caring more about her crusade for truth than about the pain it was causing everyone around her. Ilara fired back that Maeve was a coward, that she was choosing willful ignorance over justice, that she was perpetuating the very silence that had allowed this horror to continue for generations. They were still arguing when they found the cabin, or what remained of it, hidden so deep in the woods that it seemed like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. The structure was barely standing, its log walls green with moss and rot, its roof collapsed in places where decades of storms had found their way inside. But it was clearly the original family homestead, the place where their ancestors had retreated when the outside world became too hostile to bear. Inside, beneath layers of debris and the accumulated detritus of abandonment, they found evidence of lives lived in desperation. Newspaper clippings from the 1870s used as insulation between the logs, children's toys carved from wood by hands that had nothing else to give, and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the ravages of time, a small leather-bound diary. The handwriting was faded but legible, the words written in the careful script of someone who had learned to read and write despite the poverty and isolation of her circumstances. The diary belonged to Susanna Goins, and it was dated 1882. As Ilara read the entries aloud, her voice growing more strained with each page, both sisters began to understand that they had found the key to their family's darkest secret. Susanna wrote about her wedding day with the kind of despair usually reserved for funeral orations. She described her husband not with love or even affection, but with the complicated grief of someone mourning a relationship that had been twisted beyond recognition. "Today I married my brother Samuel," she wrote, the words stark and unadorned. "Not by choice, but by necessity, for we are the last of our line, and the land must stay in the family. Father says it is God's will, but I think God has turned his face from us entirely." The entries that followed detailed the psychological torture of a woman trapped in a situation that violated every natural instinct while being told it was her duty, her obligation to family and survival. She wrote about her love for Samuel as a brother, pure and innocent, and how that love had been poisoned by circumstances beyond their control. She described their wedding night with the clinical detachment of someone dissociating from her own experience, and the months that followed as a slow descent into a kind of madness born of moral anguish. But it was the entries about her children that finally broke both sisters completely. Susanna had borne 4 children in 6 years, and 3 of them had died in infancy, their small bodies racked by seizures and developmental problems that she described in heartbreaking detail. The 4th child, a daughter, lived to age 5 before succumbing to what sounded like severe intellectual disabilities combined, with physical deformities that made her existence a constant source of suffering. "I look at my children and see the price of our choices written in their flesh," Susanna had written in her final entry. "I see the curse that follows us, and I know now that some sins are visited upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation. We thought we were preserving our family, but we have destroyed it in ways that cannot be undone. May God forgive us, for we cannot forgive ourselves." When Ilara finished reading, the silence in the ruined cabin was absolute, except for the sound of their ragged breathing. Maeve was curled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly as if trying to comfort a pain too deep for tears. Ilara sat holding the diary like a sacred relic, understanding finally that their investigation had never been about genealogy or genetics or even family history. It had been about excavating trauma so profound that it had shaped their DNA itself, creating the persistent sadness they had carried their entire lives without understanding its source. They had found their truth, but it was a truth that felt like damnation, a revelation that their very existence was built on the bones of children who had paid the price for their ancestors' impossible choices. The hope they had started with, that knowledge would bring healing, that understanding would provide closure, had been replaced by the crushing weight of inherited guilt and the terrible recognition that some wounds run too deep ever to heal. The drive back from the abandoned cabin passed in silence so complete that it felt like mourning, and when they finally reached their small house nestled in the fold of the mountain, both sisters sat in the car for several minutes without moving, as if crossing the threshold into their normal lives would somehow diminish the magnitude of what they had discovered. Susanna's diary lay between them on the seat, like a piece of evidence from a crime scene, its leather binding worn smooth by time, and the desperate hands that had once poured their anguish onto its yellowed pages. Inside the house, they moved through the familiar rooms like ghosts, each lost in their own processing of the horror they had unearthed. But something had shifted between them in that ruined cabin, some fundamental understanding that the weight of their family secret was too heavy for either of them to carry alone. When Maeve finally spoke, her voice was hoarse from crying, but steadier than it had been in weeks. "We can't let this destroy us," she said, settling beside Alara on the couch where they had first opened the genetic test results that had started this nightmare. "If we tear each other apart over this, then we're just continuing the cycle. We're letting the past win." Alara looked at her sister and saw something she recognized, not defeat, but a kind of fierce protectiveness that went beyond their relationship to encompass all the women who had come before them, all the children who had paid the ultimate price for choices made in desperation. They had started this journey seeking answers about their heritage, but what they had found was something deeper and more important: the knowledge that they were the inheritors of both trauma and responsibility, and that how they chose to carry that inheritance would determine whether their family's story ended in darkness or finally found some measure of light. The confrontation with Aunt Ophelia came 3 days later, when they arrived at her farmhouse armed not with accusations but with Susanna's diary, and a shared determination to finally break through the wall of silence that had protected and poisoned their family for generations. The old woman took one look at the leather-bound book in Alara's hands, and her face crumpled like paper, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment, while simultaneously dreading its arrival. "Where did you find it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the winter wind that rattled the windows of her kitchen. "In the old cabin," Maeve said gently, "hidden under the floorboards where Susanna left it." Ophelia's composure shattered then, 73 years of carefully maintained silence, dissolving into a torrent of grief and confession that came pouring out like water from a broken dam. She told them how the story had been passed down through the women of the family, a whispered burden of knowledge that each generation of mothers had carried like a cross. She spoke of her own mother's anguish, of late-night conversations filled with tears and apologies for sins that weren't even her own, of the way the weight of inherited shame had shaped every decision their family had made for over a century. "Your great-great-grandmother was Susanna's sister," Ophelia said through her tears. "She survived when Susanna didn't, carried the guilt of that survival her entire life. She made us promise, all of us women, that we would never let the world know what our family had done to survive. She thought she was protecting us, protecting our children from the shame of it." But the most shocking revelation came when Ophelia looked directly at Alara and spoke in a voice heavy with decades of buried truth. "Sheriff Mullins knows because his family carries the same burden. The Mullins and the Goins were branches of the same poison tree. His great-grandfather was brother to one of ours, married his own sister when there was no one else left. Brody's been trying to protect all of us, not just from scandal, but from the kind of attention that would destroy what's left of our families. The knowledge that their antagonist had been motivated not by malice, but by his own inherited shame, added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. They were all victims of the same historical circumstances, all carrying genetic and psychological damage from choices made by people who had been driven to desperation by poverty, isolation, and the systematic marginalization of their community. In the weeks that followed, the sisters made a decision that surprised even them. They would not expose their family's secrets to the world, would not transform their ancestors' suffering into a public spectacle or academic curiosity. Instead, they would honor the truth by ensuring it was acknowledged within their own family, by breaking the cycle of silence that had turned their heritage into a source of shame rather than understanding. Ilara spent months crafting an article for the Journal of Appalachian Studies, but it was not the exposé that some might have expected. Instead, she wrote with the careful precision of a historian and the deep empathy of a descendant, exploring the social and economic forces that had driven isolated mountain communities to make unthinkable choices in order to survive. She wrote about the systematic dispossession of Melungeon families, about the way prejudice and poverty had created conditions that made desperate measures seem like the only options available. She gave her ancestors dignity in death that they had been denied in life, contextualizing their choices within the broader framework of American marginalization and survival. Maeve, meanwhile, began a project at the county library to collect and preserve the oral histories of the region's oldest residents, ensuring that the full complexity of Appalachian life would be documented and understood rather than reduced to stereotypes or hidden away in shame. She interviewed elderly women who remembered whispered stories, men who recalled families that had simply disappeared from the hollows, people who carried fragments of truth that had never been assembled into a complete picture. On a cold morning in early spring, the sisters returned to the hidden cemetery on their property, carrying with them a simple granite headstone that bore no names, but simply read, "In memory of the children who rest here, you are not forgotten." They had decided against trying to identify individual graves or attempting to research the specific children who lay beneath the earth. Instead, they chose to honor them collectively, to acknowledge their existence and their suffering without exploiting their stories for closure they didn't deserve to find. As they placed the stone among the small mounds, Ilara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the weight she had carried her entire life without understanding its source. The persistent melancholy would never fully leave them. It was written too deeply into their genetic code for that, but it no longer felt like a curse. Instead, it had become a form of remembrance, a way of honoring the ancestors who had suffered so that their descendants might have the luxury of choices they had never possessed. The victory was quiet, private, the kind of healing that happened not in grand gestures, but in the daily decision to face truth with compassion rather than judgment. They had broken the cycle of silence that had defined their family for generations, and in doing so had finally given their ancestors what they had been denied in life. The recognition that their choices, however terrible their consequences, had been born of love rather than evil, of desperation rather than depravity. Sometimes the only justice possible was the justice of understanding, and sometimes that had to be enough.